It is a thrill to come out to Flores and to such a wonderful congregation. Honestly, I went to get my hair cut, and you can probably tell I had it cut since last week. And so I was there in this little shop around the corner from our house, Hispanic place. Always a little struggle to communicate. We were chatting about this and that. And the woman, at some point, I don't remember how we got onto it, but the subject of Herndon came up. I said, oh, yeah, I was out in Herndon. She said, oh, well, really? Why? I said, well, I was at Flores United Methodist Church. Flores! That church is great! And I said, wow. And she wasn't a regular member, but she knew what was going on here. She knew about the ministry here and so forth. So, it is wonderful to be in ministry with you all. I do feel like Wesley's in ministry with churches like Flores, and so it's a pleasure to be back. Pleasure to be back. So we're talking tonight. We're continuing our reflection on faith and science, and we could go on and on and on, but we've really just taken two subjects that, in a sense, relate to, you could say, Genesis 1. Last week, we reflected together on cosmology and the first few verses of Genesis, let there be light. And tonight, we're going to move a little further, few verses down to, and let there be birds of the air and fish of the sea and things that creep upon the face of the earth. And let there be humankind made in my image. So we're going to talk about life, the emergence of life, and quite specifically, we're going to think about it in conversation with the theory of evolution. So Christian faith and evolution, we're going to talk about two aspects. We're going to begin with the question of design and the questions that evolution raises for traditional conceptions about God as a designer of the natural world. And then if time permits, we're going to go on to another subject that's also related to evolution in life. That's not as considered as often, and that is the question of suffering and death. Because one of the things that evolution helps open our eyes to is the massive amounts of life that have occurred over human history, but also the great, immense oceans of suffering and death. And it raises questions from the point of view of Christian faith about the meaning of suffering and death in the larger natural world. But let's begin with the first issue, and that first issue is design. And the fact that when we behold the natural world, we see a world that gives extraordinary evidence of having been meticulously designed to perform extraordinarily precise functions with a precision and complexity and ingenuity that boggles the human imagination. Now, this is not something that we have noticed for the first time in the 20th century. This is something that was evident to people for centuries and for millennia. And in the 1700s, it had become a very standard form of an argument for the existence of God. As the Enlightenment period began to evolve in Western culture, the church increasingly lost a monopoly on opinion, and people were able to have the freedom, political and cultural freedom, to voice views that were not immediately stamped down by the church. And in this context, the church responded by saying, okay, well, we're going to persuade you that what we've traditionally been saying is true. We're going to argue, we're going to present arguments that show our traditional affirmations are true. So a particular theologian by the name of William Paley, who lived from 1743 to 1805 and lived in England, wrote a book in 1802 called Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. William Paley's book was extremely successful, went through many editions, and it was a book that was familiar to a young man, Charles Darwin, and formed part of his own education as a young man. Well, what did William Paley argue in this book called Natural Theology? He set forth a metaphor or parable. Said, suppose you were strolling across the edge of a beach, and in the midst of the shells and the rocks and the surf and the seaweed, you suddenly beheld a watch. Now, if you picked up the watch and opened the cover, you would see hands and dials and numbers and little increments marked out on the face of the dial. And you would naturally and properly think about that watch in a different way than you would think about, say, the little pebbles on the seashore. The little pebbles on the seashore, you would say, those could have been produced by the rolling waves over time. Because the function of the natural waves is such as to be able to produce a fairly simple object like a little bit of sedimentary rock rounded at the edges and so forth and so on. But that sort of explanation is not going to work for a watch because of the nature of the object. If you were to unscrew the lid and look at the components and see the finely designed and engineered gears and the way the gears mesh and the way the total thing has been engineered into produce certain functions, you would not say, oh, waves have produced this. You would not say this simply fell out of the cliff. You would say it is evident that this has been designed by an intelligence. The clock cannot have been its own designer. The natural world in which we find the clock cannot have designed the clock. Ergo, therefore, there must be a designer. That is not the clock, not the natural world. There must be an intelligence that is capable of producing something of this extraordinary complexity which achieves this goal. So this was William Paley's argument on behalf, as the title of his book said, the existence and attributes of God. And this argument, which is known, has come to be known as the argument from design. It's an argument for the existence of God, and not only for any kind of God, but for a magnificently intelligent, beyond imagining, powerful God, capable of producing not watches, of course, because we know that human beings make watches, but the organisms of the natural world. Hummingbirds, migratory birds, the kangaroo, the elephant, the human being. Open up a pleasant thought. Open up a human being on the anatomical table. Look at any single organ. The fantastic complexity of the heart, the chambers of the heart, the multiple chambers of the heart, the valves that open and close millions of times with such perfect regularity, the circulatory system, the lungs, the integration of the various systems, organs that we do not even comprehend to this day, such as the mind and consciousness. How could these have been assembled by forces as simple as waves beating against the ocean or gravity dropping rocks off a cliff? It's obviously impossible. There must be an intelligence that has created it. Well, a very, very powerful argument. And as I have said, it was an argument that formed a bedrock of intellectual foundation for why belief in God and Christian faith is credible in an age where people are sensing there's a growth of science, a growth of enlightenment, and in which the church is having to compete against other views and other voices in order to maintain its traditional view. Well, in this context, we can begin to imagine how startling it might be if someone were to come up with another explanation for how you can have organisms that appear to be designed, but in fact are not designed. That give the appearance of having an intelligence behind them, but in fact have come into being without such an intelligence. And it was, in fact, there were other people who, in Charles Darwin's day, thinking along these lines, but it was Charles Darwin who proposed the most successful account of how to explain give an alternative account of this kind of complexity. And his theory of evolution has proven successful and has now celebrated by atheists, such as the science writer Richard Dawkins, as having given a new way of looking at the natural world that doesn't require a designer. And Richard Dawkins' book on this subject, is one among many, is called The Blind Watchmaker. The watchmaker that produced this seemingly magnificent natural world is in fact blind nature. Now, we're going to go through this tonight. We're going to see both why the kind of questions that evolution raises for Christian belief. We're going to spend some time taking those seriously. As will probably not be a surprise to you, we're also going to discuss why, in my view, evolution is consistent with Christian faith, why it doesn't pose the kind of challenge that Richard Dawkins thinks it does. And in fact, why, in the end, Christian faith is more compatible with science than atheism is. That the real friendship, intellectually speaking, is between Christian faith and a scientific way of looking at the world. There's a deep compatibility between those two, even if sometimes there's a superficial conflict. Whereas the deep conflict is actually between a scientific approach to the world and atheism, which raises very puzzling questions about how we could know the natural world in the first place. Well, let's turn to Darwin. We're going to look at the elements that make up Darwin's theory. But before we do, I just got to tell you another little story. I got an email this afternoon from a former student, and she's trained in marine biology. And she, after working in the field of marine biology, had a conversion experience, wanted to go into ministry, came to seminary, prepared for the ministry, and has now just been ordained. So the email contained 2 bits of information. I've been ordained, Dr. Solon, hooray! The other was, I'm still teaching at a community college in the area of biology, and I'm up for review. Guess what they want me to talk about? Evolution. They've heard that I'm a Christian. They've heard that I'm ordained. They want to see if I'm going to come and try to, misrepresent the science out of my Christian faith. Can we talk about it some before we? I said, guess what I'm talking about tonight at Flores. So part of what we can do tonight is help. This will be a dry run for how we would talk to her and how we can both address the integrity of evolutionary science and the integrity of Christian faith. All right. The theory of evolution that Darwin presented is a complex theory, and it contains at least 4 elements that I'm going to single out. And each of them raises different kinds of question. One aspect of his theory is simply the postulation of lots of time. And since that's kind of colloquially put, let me make it a little bit more technical. Lots of time. Time scales on a time on a scale that humans frankly hadn't been accustomed to thinking about until modern period. I think it was Bishop Butler who calculated the approximate age of the world according to the Bible, trying to add up the various generations and Methuselah's lifespan and so forth, and came to about 6,000 years. The Jewish calendar, traditional calendar, I think we're in the year 5,000 something right now, 5,700 something. I could be wrong about that, but we're in that neighborhood. Well, geological time that Darwin is thinking about, life on Earth, he speculates into the hundreds of thousands and millions of years. Now we think that life on Earth may have originated 1 billion years ago on a planet that's been around for 5 billion years. So we're talking, for one thing, about lengths of time that are truly staggering. This is important because evolution, the theory of evolution involves the notion that very, very simple changes, when repeated lots and lots and lots of times, can have cumulative effects that are staggering, but that are only possible over lots geological periods of time. Well, this raises already, we can see, a problem. I've already mentioned it. Lots of time raises what problem with Genesis? Yeah. It raises the issue of what we might call a young Earth, 6,000 years old, versus an Earth that is hundreds of millions or billions of years old. And so already that's an issue that concerns some Christians, because it conflicts with a literal or historical reading of the book of Genesis, or at least with one way of interpreting the literal or historical meaning. Another element of evolutionary theory is common descent. Prior to Darwin, it was common to think of species, and this was the way Aristotle thought of them, species having independent existence. People were aware that species themselves could change. After all, human beings have been breeding animals from the beginning of human history, where we know that you can breed dogs and to have sheep dogs, we can breed cows and horses and so forth. So we have a good knowledge. We do not have any firsthand experience, however, of species changing into other species. Species, for the most part, remain interbreeding communities. And this was the way in which species were generally understood prior to Darwin. Darwin did alter people's conception by postulating the possibility that the tree of life consists finally of one tree of common descent from simple to increasingly complex. This is fascinating in itself, I think, because if we take the theory of common descent seriously, as I mentioned last week, it implies that life originated on planet Earth how many times? Once. Which in itself is really a pretty staggering thought. It suggests to me that the conditions that permit the origin, and of course the origin of life is a big mystery. Not only is the origin of life mystery from the point of view of scientists, and of which I'm not one, I'm a theologian who's interested in science. From the point of view of scientists, merely defining life is very challenging, imagining the conditions of life. But if life originated only once, then that suggests that it was really quite an extraordinary set of circumstances that led to it. If there were multiple origins of life, then we would expect to see be able to identify different trees of life with fundamentally different characteristics or different chemical compositions. We don't find this. People are looking, and we may yet find it, but we have not yet found it. So thus far, the supposition of common descent has been supported. Well, this too raises questions, doesn't it? It poses challenges for a simple reading of the book of Genesis. What are the questions that it raises?
My understanding is the Genesis account would have you believe that all animals in existence today were created in their current form.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It doesn't, it doesn't say anything other than just that God created them, and the application is that they increase and they multiply, but not that they change. Moreover, they seem to have different origins. The day on which God creates human beings is a different day, and there's not any sense of descent. And so this picture is a picture that seems to get the sequence right. The animals come before humans, and in that sense, I think it's still pretty darn interesting. Nevertheless, it postulates a common descent rather than different origins. So that's another. All right. Number 3. Random variation. Also known as random mutation. This is a really important one. We're going to come back to this one. This ends up being a key one. But the basic idea is simple, and one that human beings have known through our practice of breeding. We know that different stallions and mares produce different kinds of offspring with different qualities. Well, where do those different qualities come from? Presumably, there was some sort of biological inheritance conveyed from one generation to the next generation that produced these different qualities, different degrees of strength or intelligence, and then you end up breeding the most intelligent, the strongest. You don't breed the least intelligent, and so forth and so on. Well, of course, human beings don't control. They are able to identify the strength and the intelligence, but they don't make the animals strong and intelligent. So there seems to be something that, and Darwin was aware of this, there seems to be something biologically inherent that's passed from one generation to that can vary. And he didn't know what it was. Of course, in the 20th century, we have identified it as genes and DNA. But he speculated there had to be something like this that underwent that produced variations that were random, various mutations that were passed down to progeny. So the different progeny got different assemblages of he called them granules, he not having a genetic theory to work with. Now we know that what's at stake, or what we think is at stake, is the coding process of DNA and RNA periodically breaks down in such a way that the codes are not reproduced exactly, and there is a new variation produced. And that variation can show up then in the genotype, which is simply to say the biological manifestation of the host of that DNA in terms of new qualities or features. And the process by which this happens seems to be basically random. The fourth element of the theory is natural selection. Now, natural selection and random variation is the heart of Darwin's insight. Natural selection means that the environment will select, and since select implies agency, it's a little bit misleading. Let's not use the word select. Let's say the natural environment will eliminate mutations that are not adapted to its context. So the biology produces a variety of manifestations. Nature acts on those, eliminating those that do not confer advantages or that confer disadvantages, and tolerating or receiving or selecting those offspring that where the mutation is advantageous, such that those are able to reach breeding age and in turn produce offspring that have the advantageous mutation. Those that lack the advantageous mutation don't make it to breeding age, and that particular feature, whatever it may have been, gradually fades out of the population. Well, this is a very simple mechanism. Notice that it doesn't require a designer. What it requires is random mutation and then the force of natural elimination working on the population. Darwin's theory and wager was that if you have enough time and enough generations and enough mutations, then in time, through a process that is itself extremely simple, organisms can begin to develop that manifest extraordinary complexity because they are suited to survive in their environment. And so that the adaptations that have been selected are all ones that work together in order to fit that particular platypus or goose or cherrystone clam or messenger pigeon into its ecological niche and permit it to reproduce and survive. Every time there's a mutation that enhances that, the enhancement gets passed on to children and makes them equally able or superior in their ability to reproduce and thrive. Adaptations that do not support the furthered life of an individual tend to prohibit it from reproducing, tend not to get passed on, ergo that particular. If you've got enough time, then in time what will be produced are organisms that manifest the complexity that William Paley thought required a designer, but that according to Darwin, now don't. That's Darwin's extraordinary idea. Let me just stop there and see if there are just questions about that. Okay, well, let's assess which of these poses the most serious problem or challenge to Christian faith. And I'm going to speak just candidly from my own personal point of view. I'll share with you. You may not agree with me. Certainly not everybody does. I've learned this in my 54 years. But you can consider it and see where you come down. In my opinion, frankly, some of these are not very serious challenges. They pose rather superficial conflict with Christian faith, but not deep-going conflict. In my opinion, the notion of lots of time versus 7 days is an example of superficial conflict. It's not a very profound issue. The writers of the book of Genesis were working with the cosmology of their day. They were writing for the purpose of interpreting who God is and God's purposes in the world. As Israel and the church has received those documents, it hasn't received them for the purpose of having authoritative natural history and cosmology, but for learning about the character of God and God's purposes for the world. As the United Methodist Church affirms, Scripture is inspired in matters of faith and life, but it's not necessarily inerrant with respects to issues of geography and linguistics and cosmology. So the Bible knows it's a fantastically awesome universe. If this universe is 14 billion years old instead of 6,000 years old, I say, wow, that's even more wonderful and awesome. If life on Earth is a matter of 1 billion years instead of 6,000 years, then to me that simply speaks to the magnificence of life. So that's not common descent. Well, I've already told you, I think the notion that life originates on this planet once is an extraordinarily mysterious idea. The Bible doesn't say anything explicit about common descent, and it suggests strongly that the descent is not united. But here too, I don't see this as a very deep-going conflict. I think of it as superficial. If we're part of a single branching tree, this does not imply, although some people think it does, that human beings are not special or unique. We may be part of a common tree of life, and yet I think there are good reasons for thinking that the human branch is extraordinary, unique, and remarkable, even in biological terms.
But is that saying that all life on Earth, extinct, everything that was ever created, came from a one-celled organism?
It could not even have been a one-celled organism. It would have to have even been simpler, because the biology of the one-celled organisms that we are so fantastically complex that to go from simple, inert, lifeless chemical processes to a one-celled organism would be like a tornado going through a junkyard and producing a 747. This is one of the puzzles about the origin of life. But it does imply that there was some chain of life, like a fire, that caught and that eventually produced one-cell organisms. And of course, most life on this planet to this day is bacteria. Bacteria in terms of biomass is more than the rest of the planet, life put together. So 99% of the biomass of the world is bacteria. But everything's related, and at some point it would have evolved into one-cell structures. So I guess the answer is, in that sense, yes. So I don't think that's natural selection. Is that a big problem? Well, it does raise questions, and we'll talk about that when we get to suffering. But again, that the environment imposes constraints on reproduction, that's something we've known for millennia. That's something we've experienced. We understand that human history understands that strong people survive hard winters and weak people don't. That strong livestock survive droughts and weak don't. So the force of natural selection is not new news. And so that too doesn't seem to me to be an extraordinarily difficult issue. Now, these together do suggest that one way of reading the Bible is not going to work. And that is a kind of an inerrantist reading of the Bible, where everything the Bible has said is understood historically and defended as a kind of a natural history report. Now, you may remember, if you were here last week, actually Augustine himself argued against reading the Bible in that way, because he didn't want people to read the Bible in ways that immediately came into conflict with natural science. So we're going to, how then would we read Genesis if we don't read it historically? Well, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr said we take the Bible seriously, but not literally. We read it seriously, but not literally, and seriously, but not historically in some passages. The Swiss theologian Karl Barth, who's one of my favorite theologians, and a magnificent affirmer of resurrection and the creed and all that, was asked one time after he was talking about Genesis, somebody said, "Herr Barth, but did the snake really talk?" And he said, "Madam, it does not matter whether the snake talked. It matters what the snake said." The point is what the snake says. That's the level at which it communicates to us. So to take the Bible literally, seriously but not literally, is to engage the meanings that it's conveying, while not necessarily going down the rabbit hole of whether everything happened exactly in the way it's portrayed. So in those ways, these are not, I don't think, deep-going conflicts. They raise superficial conflicts that, unfortunately, some Christians take to be, I think, far more serious than they really are. Now, random variation and mutation's a little bit different. And here, the key word that causes so much confusion is the word random. There is a potential conflict here, and we're going to have to sort out two different things in which, two different ways in which random can be used. Within the strict context of evolutionary theory, not going into philosophy, metaphysics, theology, or anything, within the context of evolutionary theory in a strict sense, random has a very specific meaning. Random means that the mutation arises without any correlation to the environment. All it means is that mutation arises in the DNA and it has no correlation with the environment, so that there is no way of knowing in advance whether any given mutation is going to prove to be beneficial or detrimental to the organism's life in that particular context. That's what random means. Now, if you think about it, that's what random has to mean. Because after all, it has to have that kind of limited sense. Because after all, if you think of the DNA as a biochemical reaction itself, things don't happen randomly at that level. If there is a mutation, there's a reason for the mutation in terms of that you can be understood within. It may not be beneficial, but there's a reason for it. It's not random. Chemists don't say, "Oh, that was a random reaction." They understand the laws and the qualities of different elements that produce different things. So random does not imply kind of haphazard, uncontrolled. It simply means that the mutation arises without a correlation to the environment. That is a randomness that Christian theology can live with. But what happens a great deal is that proponents of evolutionary theory unwittingly, but nevertheless consistently, read more into the word random than is legitimate than they legitimately can. Namely, they take it to mean that the whole process of the origin and descent of life, the branching of life, the complexity of life, the emergent, that the whole thing is random and unguided. Now, if you use this word as a trap door to insert a philosophical or a metaphysical or a theological commitment that interprets the entire thing as random and unguided, at that point, Christian theology is going to object. Because while, in my opinion, Christian theology can indeed live with the notion that there's no correlation between, or at least no physical correlation that we can detect between the mutation and the environment, Christian theology is not going to be able to live with the notion that the entire process is unguided or random or a product of chance alone. Because from the point of view of Christian faith, the process as a whole needs to, if God is a God who creates and whose providence is at work in the world, the process as a whole must in some sense be an expression of God's creative purposes. So the Bible, in that case, tells us that God is a creator and that life is good. Evolution becomes an account of how God creates. Evolution doesn't tell us that God exists. It doesn't tell us that God's creator. It gives us insight into how something happens that we believe in for other reasons and on other grounds. Now, at that point, of course, Christians are not making a strictly scientific claim. We're making a theological or a philosophical claim in which we say that during lots of time and this process of common descent and the variation in natural selection, we believe that there is a supervening wisdom and loving kindness at work manifesting a purpose, which is God's purpose, which is for life, for animal life, ultimately for human life. And in this sense, the design that is manifested by the natural world and by human beings is, while it may be random in the narrow sense that it's produced by the instrument of mutation that has no correlation, is at a deeper level not random in the sense that it's guided by God. Now, as I say, that's not a scientific claim. That is an affirmation of faith. But I have to say, neither is it a scientific claim if scientists say, well, because the mutation arises randomly, therefore science teaches us that the process as a whole is blind and undirected. No, that's a philosophical or a kind of an anti-theological point of view that they're bringing to evolutionary theory. They're entitled to that view. There's nothing about, I think that, as I say, I think that there are problems with finally interpreting evolution as simply a product of blind luck. I think it's less probable, but I'm not going to go there for the moment. But they're entitled to that view. What they're not entitled to do is what happens too often is presented as science. It's not good science. It's scientism, so to speak. It's when a philosophical view is dressed up with the authority of science. Okay. Let's, how are we doing on time? I didn't bring my watch tonight.
About 8:17.
Okay. Thank you. I want now. Let's say let's dig just a little bit deeper into this issue. I've suggested that evolutionary theory is compatible with Christian faith because, in effect, what it's telling us is how God does something. And Christians can live with that how. What they can't live with is a claim that God isn't, in some sense, the director or intelligence behind it. Let's look at two different ways of fleshing out that Christian belief. One of these ways I'm going to suggest is better than the other. And I think both of them will be somewhat familiar to you. But one of them has a familiar name because it's been in the news, namely intelligent design. Okay, that's one way of trying to interpret how God is involved in the guidance of evolution. It's in my opinion, the inferior way, problematic way. Intelligent design is probably the reason why my former student was asked to talk on evolution for her trial when she goes to give her lecture on biology at the community college, because what they wanted to see is she going to teach intelligent design? And so to get our heads around intelligent design, I want to start with two different pictures of the way God acts in the world. And they're both going to come from the world of theater. Let's do the intelligent design first. In ancient Greek theater, there was this point in the plot where the various plot lines had gotten so complicated and the problems had reached such a magnitude that there was no earthly way that you could get your hero out of the predicament they were in, unless a god came down from the proscenium arch right down into the middle of the play and solved the problem. This has come to be known as the Deus ex machina, the God from a machine. And so when you're writing a play and you create a plot that you can't solve in any other way, you just said, and then God came. And God sorted it all out. You've got this hole in the story, and then you call it. Well, in terms of scientific explanation, what this corresponds to is the so-called the God of the gaps. We construct a scientific explanation of the world, but we discover there are things we don't know and we don't understand. For example, Newton understood vastly more about the planetary motions because of his simple formulas about gravity, and yet even with those, there were aspects of his calculations that didn't entirely mesh with the observations. So he thought, well, that's probably what God's doing. He's fixing the little bits of deviation. It's the God of the gaps. We find out what we can't explain, and then we insert God. See, like God comes down in the machine and fixes everything. Okay. Here's the other explanation. And it goes like, here's the question to think about. Who killed Hamlet's father in the play Hamlet by Shakespeare? That is a correct answer. That is an absolutely correct answer. Hamlet's father was killed by Claudius, his uncle. But there's another correct answer. Shakespeare. Now, the two answers, what's interesting about that is both answers are completely correct in their own framework. and they don't compete with each other. Within the context of the play, Hamlet's father is killed by his uncle, by the king's brother. And we've got all this complex explanation that illuminates how this happened and why it came about. And we don't want anybody to come in, from above. And at the same time, in another sense and at a deeper level, the person who killed Hamlet's father was the man who wrote the story. Just as he did everything in the story. From the smallest little thing to the biggest thing is all being done by Shakespeare. So you've got two levels of explanation that are going on at the same time, both of which are complete in their own terms, and neither of which makes the other superfluous. Now that way of, the first way, the God of the gaps way of understanding God's action is what the logic that lies behind intelligent design. The alternative way is a more classical way that talks about God acting in the world in the difference between primary and secondary causes. Hamlet's uncle killing, here's a little bit of trivia. What was the name of Hamlet's father? I didn't know. I had to look it up on Google today. Hamlet. Is King Hamlet. So Hamlet's father, Hamlet, gets killed by Claudio. That is a secondary cause. That is the way in which the natural world itself is bringing about causes in terms that are inherent or internal to the framework of the play, and in terms of science, internal or inherent in the natural world. Primary cause is God's action that is working in and through the secondary causes, not picking out one gap where it's active, but active in the whole thing. Now, the interesting thing about primary and secondary causation is that it's really what I think we can safely call the classical way of understanding how God acts in the world. It's how Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Karl Barth and other theologians would talk about it. The God of the gaps view is a more modern view. Namely, that we reach a certain point where we can't come up with an explanation, and then we bring in God as doing what nature can't do. So, according to intelligent design, what is it about the process of evolution that is a gap that needs God? Well, and I don't mean to suggest that proponents of intelligent design are stupid or ignorant people. They're not. They're very, very bright people. They're very thoughtful, well-informed people. I think they're misguided theologically, but that doesn't mean they're dumb by any stretch of the imagination. They point to a phenomenon that they call irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity is simply, and this was something that Darwin himself recognized, if there's any point in the process of common descent where you can't get to some outcome by the previous stage, and there seems to be no pathway that could end in a certain result, then the theory of evolution falls apart. Because then you do need a designer. And intelligent design says the natural world is filled with realities that are so fantastically complex that they involve a multiplicity of interlocking parts, such that if any one part had not been there, the totality would not function, like a mousetrap, and that's kind of an example. Take away any one piece of a mousetrap, and the mousetrap is useless. A mousetrap cannot have evolved because prior to being a mousetrap, it was a useless thing. It had had no function, no adaptability in its environment. So the only thing that could ever have originated was the ensemble as a whole. Well, proponents of intelligent design say lots of things in nature suggest that they could have evolved through step-by-step mutation. Say the transition from one species of horse to another species of horse. And we see that. But some things are so complex that it's very difficult to see how they can have arisen through minute steps. Single-celled organisms are actually an example. The eye. And according to Darwin's own confession, when he thought about the complexity of the human eye, it gave him almost a sense of queasiness and nausea. He was just overcome by the awesome notion that this can have arisen at all. Let me give you an example. It's kind of fascinating of an example of irreducible complexity. The so-called bacterial flagella or flagellum. So little one-celled bacteria, you see them in the shows, have these little things and they go across. That's the flagellum. Well, go home tonight and Google bacterial flagellum and get a cross-section of how the thing is put together. You will swear you are looking at a Ford outdoor engine. You will swear the thing was produced by engineers. There is an axle. There is a housing that contains the axle. There are gears that interlock. There is the whip at the end of the axle. There is the energy. It can spin in both directions, up to 100,000 times a minute or a second. I forget which one. It can reverse within a quarter of a turn. It can start going the other way. And the whole thing is put together in such a way that if you ask, how could any one piece of this have not been there previously, you can't imagine. And so this is an example of irreducible complexity. And intelligent design says, look, okay, we haven't proved that it can't have arisen through mutation. But you guys haven't proved that it can. We've got two theories. Teach them both in the science classroom. One theory says these sort of things are too complex to have risen. We've given you why we think it can't have complex. That's a scientific theory. We say intelligent design is the best explanation. You all say we don't know how yet, but maybe it could have. Well, that's kind of weak. Just teach them both. That's all we're asking. So it went to trial, and they argued all this in court, and they had the little bacterial flagellum in there, and and the intelligent design lost. And it's good that they lost. Why did they lose? Well, because the nature of science is not to know things. And the nature of science is to investigate what we don't know with the anticipation that we'll be able to eventually give natural explanations for what we do not presently understand. Science is not, scientific method as it has evolved and hasn't been in the business of saying, this is something we don't understand, intelligent design produced it. So while intelligent design might belong in a religion class or a philosophy class, it doesn't belong in the biology class. And that's why it failed the test of being good science. And the reason it fails the test of being good theology, in my point of view, is because it relies on the idea of a God of the gaps. It tries to to shoehorn God into the natural process by finding things we don't understand and then saying God must have done that and the other things. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is not to, well, we can, have an open mind, I suppose, about things like the flagellum, but fundamentally, we aren't concerned about the notion that eventually it would be possible to find natural explanations for everything. Just as we think there's a good play explanation for who killed Hamlet's father. It doesn't bother us because our confidence is that God wrote the whole play. And God's ability to direct and affect his will in and through the whole play is vastly superior to Shakespeare's ability to orchestrate the reality of Hamlet. So there's no need to, and there's good reason not to go in the direction of intelligent design, and nevertheless to have confidence that in time the overarching purposes of evolution are a revelation of the purposes of God. And here I think we can step back and say, what does evolution as a whole show to us? And I think we can say it shows a God whose purposes work in the direction of life, and not only life, but finally sentient life, and not only sentient life, but self-conscious life, life that can have an appreciation of things like goodness and love and beauty and truth, and that has the fantastic power of understanding the natural world. So far from being inconsistent with the notion of a designer, creative God, it seems to me to be profoundly consistent with the idea of a God who's at work in the natural processes. I don't think we're going to get to suffering tonight. I think I'm going to do just one little bit more, and then we'll open things up for questions. I want to address a counter-argument that comes back at what I've said from the scientist Richard Dawkins. The name Richard Dawkins may be familiar to some of you. He's written a book called The God Delusion. He himself is an evolutionary biologist. He's writes a lot. He writes very, very well. I have to give the man credit. He is a great stylist. And if you get his books on that are strictly kind of his evolutionary biology books, they're wonderful books and they're exciting. His books that go into the area of theology, like The God Delusion, are not very good books, but they're very influential. And so one of the things that Richard Dawkins in his writings propagates is that the whole notion of God is inherently problematic when viewed from the point of view of evolution. And the reason is, he argues this: the genius of evolution is that it provides a simple explanation for complexity. You've got things that look designed and are extraordinarily complex, but you're explaining them via a very, very simple mechanism. And it's the simplicity of the explanation that gives it its power. Now, he says, the trouble with invoking God as the ultimate cause that's manifested through the natural world is because if the world is complex, then God must be even more complex. However complicated the world is, God must be vastly more complicated. And in effect, you're trying to explain you're trying to explain a complicated world by invoking something that's even more complicated. And to which he says the question is obvious. If God created it, who created God? If God's... And Richard Dawkins is extremely proud of this argument. So if nothing else, you can see it makes him happy. And it's clear that it's convinced him. Many, many people have responded to Richard Dawkins, explaining to him why this is not as powerful a rebuttal as he thinks it is. And it doesn't seem to have gotten through yet, as he keeps repeating it. But meanwhile, we can try to understand why it's not a very good argument. First thing is, let's say that he was right about God being complicated. He's not. We're going to come to that in a second. But even if God were complicated, it's not true that we have to be able to answer the question, where did God come from? When you give an explanation for some state of affairs, you don't have to be able to explain the explanation. Sometimes it's enough to simply point to the explanation. For example, if we got to Mars and we discovered on a portion of Mars that we haven't been able to investigate before, an ice chest with Coca-Cola and Schlitz in it, we would have to say that did not get there by Martian. And they say, how did that get there? I haven't got the foggiest. It's very complicated. But we can still be very confident. We can't explain the explanation, but we can confidently say it wasn't produced by the Martian atmosphere. An intelligence produced that cooler. What intelligence for what purpose beats me. But we're justified in advancing that argument. So if we, from the point of view of Christian faith, say we believe that God is the ultimate cause of the world, and no, I can't explain how God can be eternal, that's not any more problematic than what we do in other circumstances. But here's the more important point. Dawkins is wrong to think that we rightly think about God as something that's very, very, very complicated. The truth is, and we really need a whole session on systematic theology, but really the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition and Muslim tradition actually have all agreed that God is extraordinarily simple. Now that sounds odd at first, but actually it begins to make sense when you think about what complexity means. Complexity means built up out of parts. Anything that's built up out of parts is dependent on those parts. Anything that's complex is secondary to whatever composed it. Things that are simple, on the other hand, another way of saying what something is simple, it's also basic. It can't be reduced into something else. God is simple in the sense that God is ultimate, not composed of other things or parts, whether spiritual or immaterial. Further, God is simple in the sense we can also have this same insight if we think about the way natural explanation works. The more powerful our explanations of the world get, the simpler our equations become. E equals mc squared is very simple. Before that, you needed lots of equations to explain lots of phenomena that you couldn't coordinate together. Then Einstein, with a tremendous act of insight, realized the laws were much simpler. So as we get more basic, reality doesn't get more complicated, reality gets simpler. God is the ultimate source of reality, in part because God is absolutely ultimate, not composed of parts, and thus profoundly simple, not complex. And it's exactly the simplicity of God that is part of how God can be the foundation of a world that does show complexity, And God can be God can be both transcendent to us and active in our lives, in part because God's not a being that has to go back and forth as material realities do. So people have explained to Richard Dawkins that, you may think of God as very, very complicated, but that is not how the Christian tradition understands God. God's nature. And I think that that's an explanation that Christians can and should take seriously, even if it has yet to make an impression on Richard Dawkins himself. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us in a surprising place. At the end of the day, I'm convinced that, and this is not unique to me, this has also been proposed by a Christian philosopher, Cornelius Plantinga. He's got a great book. But Cornelius Plantinga says that where the conflict really lies is not between science and faith, but between science and atheism. Science and faith are actually at a deep level in concord, because science gives us confidence that human beings are able to genuinely understand our fantastically human. Think about for a second. Things that grew, according to evolutionary theory, out of the primeval stew of the ocean, gradually walking upright and now acquiring the ability to comprehend the universe, to talk about it in a way that sees into the distant galaxies and formulate theories that are proved true. How can this be? Well, it makes a lot of sense if human beings are created in the image of God. If God's nature is to be intelligent and have loving kindness, and to create a world in which creatures are able to arise and have some of the characteristics of God, an ability to know and to understand and to communicate and to be conscious. So in other words, science manifests the kind of things that we would expect if it were true that human beings are reflections of a good creative God. But now let's say that the atheists are right, that the world is a product of blind chance, that life emerges out of a fantastically improbable happenstance, and that evolution is simply one long series of accidents after another. What is the likelihood that out of that, creatures would emerge that actually could understand the world, that could formulate theories that are true? I think it's very improbable. I think it's very unlikely. I think that at that point one has a tension between the notion of a blind, indifferent material world and the claims that there is such a thing as truth. On the other hand, when we look at things from the point of view of Christian faith, I think we're back in a position where we can say, because of our faith in God, we are not surprised to see harmony between the book of nature and the book of Scripture. That just as Scripture talks about human beings as created in the image of God and reflecting the mental capacities of God at a vastly lower level, so science suggests that human beings are able to grow and develop and investigate the natural world and discover things that are true. These things are in harmony. They're not in conflict. So, that's enough for tonight.